Hi friends, this is a recording for those of you who did not attend the Zoom meeting. So we're going to look at your first assignment, that is bracketing ISO and equivalent exposures. And we'll just go over them pretty quickly so you'll have a sense of what I was looking for and so on. Okay, so we'll start with Alvaro. And we're looking here at the bracketing section, so you can see the two sets of three. And Alvaro did a good job here. So this first image is the correctly exposed image. The second is underexposed, and the third overexposed. And again, the purpose of bracketing is to ensure that you make a correct exposure when you're in a lighting situation where that might be a problem, where the light meter can be fooled. So situations where you have all of one tone, very dark or light. So let's say you have your white dog up in the snow. The light meter is designed to read the world in gray, 18% gray, medium gray, middle gray. And so whatever you point the meter at, it will give you a meter reading to render that area that gray. And normally that's fine. But in a situation such as I described, a white dog in snow, you don't want the snow to be gray. You want it to be textured white. And so that is one situation in which the light meter can be fooled. And so you might want to make multiple exposures at different exposures, multiple frames at different exposures, to ensure that one of them is correct. Okay, now of course with digital cameras, you have instant feedback, so you can figure that out anyway. So this is an exercise. Great job on both of these sets. You can see that with the correctly exposed image here, it's a slightly high contrast situation. The sky is still a bit bright, and some of the shadows are pretty dark, but it's a good compromise. So the underexposed image is just too dark, except for the sky. The sky looks great, but in order to get the sky looking great, you have to underexpose the rest of the frame. And finally, in the overexposed image, the shadow areas look great. You have nice detail there, but everything else is too bright. Okay, good. Let's look at equivalent exposures where we only have one image. So Alvaro, get me the other images and I will grade them. Okay. ISO. And so with both the equivalent exposures and the ISO sets of images, what I wanted to see was all of the images at the same exposure. So the same in terms of light and dark. So with ISO, you were to expose the same shot, the same setting for each whole stop ISO rating that you have. And so this looks great from 100 to 1280. So as the ISO rating increases, the sensitivity to light also increases, and therefore the light requirement decreases. So as you increase the ISO rating, you need less light to make a proper exposure. And so the camera handled that fine up to, let's see, so this one here is 1/250th of a second at f/25 at ISO 6400. But notice that the next image with the same settings, 1/250th at f/25 at ISO 12800, now this image is lighter. And that is because the camera had nowhere to go. f/25 at this setting at 20 millimeters is the smallest aperture that the camera can achieve. The lens can. This was shot in shutter priority, so the shutter speed cannot be changed. And so you can't change the shutter speed, can't change the aperture. So at ISO 12,800, the image is overexposed by one stop. Okay, so what one could do is start with a slower shutter speed, and then the shutter speed could be increased. Okay, all right, great job, Alvaro. Looks good. So next up is Emmanuel, and we'll look at the bracketing images, and those look great as well. So normal exposure and underexposure and overexposure. And in this case, I would say that the overexposure looks the best, this image on the far right. If we look at the metadata, we can see that it was in fact overexposed. It says 1 EV, and that means it's a +1. It was made in the aperture priority, so technically it cannot be exposed incorrectly, though actually in reality sometimes it can. But at any rate, this is a good example of when bracketing actually is a good idea, because the exposure that the light meter said was correct is actually just a little bit dark. And this exposure, the +1, actually looks really, really good. In the second set, we have overexposure, normal, and underexposure. And so you can see the underexposure is really too dark. The normal exposure looks great. The overexposure also is good, except for the highlights. So in digital photography, you do have a certain amount of latitude, actually a decent amount of latitude. So if you've over or underexposed by a stop in either direction, it's very easy to correct for that. If you underexpose by like 3 stops or overexposed by 3 stops, then you lose that actual information. It's no longer there. So that doesn't work so well, but a stop in either direction is fine. Okay, equivalent exposures. And these look really pretty good also. So with equivalent exposures, again, they should all be the same in terms of light and dark. Here's what I would expect to see in terms of difference. With the shutter speed, when the shutter speed changes, your ability to stop or show motion also changes. So the faster the shutter speed, the more it will stop or freeze motion of something that's moving. The slower the shutter speed, the more likely you are to have a blur or show that moving object as a blur. In terms of the aperture, your next assignment is depth of field assignment, the second assignment, but I expect to see a change in the depth of field as the size of the aperture changes. So if you have a fast shutter speed that lets in very little light, you would want to use a large aperture to compensate for that, because a large aperture lets in a lot of light. If you're using a slow shutter speed, where the shutter remains open for a longer period of time, that lets in a lot of light, and so you would use a small aperture that lets in less light to compensate. The larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, and the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. So in this image, I'll show the first and last. We'll select those. So the image on the left uses a fast shutter speed and a large aperture. And so there isn't actually anything moving in the frame, but that's okay. But the depth of field is shallow, so you can see the foreground, the hummingbird feeder is sharp in both images. It's in focus. But the background is out of focus. And in the second image, with a 30th of a second shutter speed at f22, the background is much more in focus. It's much sharper. And so you get great depth of field with a small aperture. But in terms of the exposure, they're pretty close. I would say that this last one is a little bit lighter than some of the others. So maybe f22 is the maximum, or I should say minimum, aperture size, and possibly this last one should have been at f32, but the lens didn't go that far. Okay. And finally, ISO. So great job on all of these, Emmanuel. The exposures are the same in all of these, from this first one with an ISO rating of 100 to the last one with an ISO rating of 6400. So if we look at them together, and let me just get rid of this side thingy, the side panel, so we can see these better. What I expect to see here really is a change in the quality of the image in terms of noise. So the digital equivalent of graininess that you would see with a higher ISO film. And so I'll wait for this to load. But I think you can see that the image on the left with the higher ISO rating at 6400 has more grain, it has more texture than the image on the right, with the ISO set at 100. And cameras that have higher ISO ratings, 12,800, 25,600, and so on, some of them go way up, you start to see quite an increase in the amount of grain or noise that you just don't see. Hopefully, you don't see it all with a low ISO rating like 100. Okay. Okay, excellent. Great job, Emmanuel. You did a really nice job on these. Okay, this next set was done by Jericho, and only one image is here. It looks as if it is a panoramic, so perhaps you loaded the wrong image into this assignment. Okay. Okay, Henry Buck, you're up. So these are for bracketing, and great job on these. As you can see, they go from dark to light. And this set of images, the first one, actually shows the sky beautifully with the underexposed image. And that you'll find is often the case when you're shooting skies. The light meter chooses an area to meter from. If you don't, you can use a zoom or whatever to isolate areas, but the light meter can only meter for one type of lighting. And so in a high contrast situation such as this, where you have bright highlights, the background, and dark shadows, the foreground, the camera has to make a choice. It can't expose correctly for both areas. And so if you're in a high contrast situation, such as this, you need to make a choice as well. So let's say you have a person standing in front of a bright door, like, this situation where you have the trees. Do you want the foreground, your subject, to be dark in silhouette or not? And if you want the subject or the foreground properly exposed, then you need to take a light meter reading of that area without the rest of it, and use that meter reading, even though when you back up, the light meter will then tell you you're not exposing correctly, that you're overexposing. And that is true, because in order to expose correctly for the shadows, you will overexpose the overall frame, and so the highlights will be overexposed. So you need to think about the framing and the lighting and how you want it to appear. And so in bracketing, you see this darkest image. The sky looks beautifully ominous, but everything else in the frame is really dark. In the properly exposed image, it's all kind of dark. The sky is a little less dark and also looks kind of ominous and beautiful. In the overexposed image, the sky is just bright, and you can see that the details of the sky, the clouds, and so on, are lost. And the difference between the skies and the trees is so great that even with this overexposure, the trees are still kind of dark. So those are some of the choices that you have to make. Okay, so the second set, these great gargoyles having a little private conversation, perhaps. And again, the underexposed one is just too dark. The correctly exposed image is also a little bit dark, but the highlights are in good control. Where in this image, the overexposed image, the highlights are just too bright. The midtones look great. The grass, which is a little too dark in the normal exposure, looks really good here in the overexposure. So again, you have to make some choices. And in Lightroom, of course, you can make these adjustments yourself very easily. So I'll just put this into the develop module. Sorry, get out of that. And this is the overexposed image. I can just bring down the exposure a bit, or if I don't want to do that, I can just bring down the highlights. And that will keep most of the rest of the image at about the same exposure. And I can bring up the contrast a little if I want. And I can play around with it as much as I want, obviously. Come on, I'm supposed to reset. Anyway, back to these. So equivalent exposures. Again, they should all be the same in terms of light and dark as they are here. So great. A 2/50th of a second at f42. That's a nice small aperture. And 1/20th of a second, sorry, at f4.2. Better put my glasses on. At f4.2. And a 20th of a second at f14. So, by the way, you only need to do the whole stop settings. You don't have to do all of them. Okay, so f14, f4.2, the background in f4.2 is a little bit probably a little bit sharper than it is with f14, but not a huge difference, in part because we're further away from the subject, and the further away you are, the greater the depth of field, the more it'll be in focus. So good job on these. And finally, ISO. And here is there is a problem. So as with the equivalent exposures, all of these should be the same in terms of light and dark. And so let's see what happened. This dark image was made at 100th of a second at f9 at ISO 200. Then ISO 400, 800, 1600, 3200. And 3200 looks really good. But with ISO 200, there's just not enough light. So again, the lower the ISO rating, the more light you need. And so what Henry could have done, what you could have done, Henry, in this situation is change the size of the aperture. So let's see, you're shooting in the manual mode, and which is great. I like it when you guys do that. But the manual mode doesn't change anything for you. So it'll tell you if you're exposing incorrectly, but it won't fix it for you. You have to do that. So if you're shooting in the manual mode, you need to pay attention to your light meter. Every time you change something, one of the settings, the situation in which you're photographing, if the amount of light changes, or you can put the camera into one of the priority modes, aperture or shutter priority, and then the camera will figure out the equivalent exposures for you. So as you change the ISO rating, the camera will change either the shutter speed or the aperture for you, so that technically, I should say theoretically, you cannot expose incorrectly in the priority modes. Practically, that's not entirely true, but generally it's true. So in the manual mode, what you could have done here, Henry, is use a larger aperture. So you're at 100th of a second, so perhaps at f2.8 or f4. And then then that would let in a couple of stops more light. And so you could expose this correctly, maybe at a 60th of a second or a 50th of a second. And then as the ISO increases and you require less light, then the camera could stop down the aperture for you till it gets to this setting at ISO 3200, 100th of a second at f9. Okay. So again, you guys can redo if you want to. I accept redos through the last week of classes. So not into finals week, but through the last week of classes. And of course, the higher grade will be recorded. Okay. All right, nice job, Henry. So next up is Jessica. So these are Jessica's bracketing images. Great job, beautiful images. And we can see here that the zero, or the correct exposure, the settings that the camera says are correct, work quite well here. It's a nice example for bracketing, again, because it has bright highlights and deep shadows, and a very nice range in between. So here's normal. This one is overexposed and underexposed. With the underexposure, you can see we have very nice tones in the highlights. With the overexposure, those are way too bright, and even the midtones are pretty bright. Excuse me, I have a piece of hair in my eye. But the shadows have opened up nicely. And then the middle image is a compromise. The highlights are a little bit bright and the shadows are a little bit dark, but overall it's very pleasing. And the same is true with the second set. So a lovely setting here. The highlights are a little bright, shadows maybe a little dark, but overall it looks really good. With the overexposure, everything is a little, well, not everything. The highlights are way too bright. Some of the midtones are bright, but the shadows open up nicely. And with the underexposure, you have really nice detail in the brightest areas, but everything else is a wee bit too dark. Okay. So equivalent exposures, not quite sure what happened here. You changed a couple of things. So the first one, obviously, the first ones are overexposed. 1/4 of a second at f8, and then an 1/8 of a second at f8, 15th of a second at f8. So the shutter speed is decreasing. It's getting faster, I should say. But the images are becoming more properly exposed. But what I wanted to see in the equivalent exposures is for the exposures to be the same, right? So, and in some of these you changed the aperture as well. So you might want to reread the assignment on that one, okay? And let's check out ISOs. And in general, the ISOs work well. So from 100 to 3200. So what happened here at the end, you're seeing, well, actually in several of them, the exposures are getting lighter. And that is because the aperture has stayed at f4. And the camera's shutter speed has a maximum of 1/2000th of a second. That's what it looks like here. And so after ISO 800, the camera could no longer compensate for the changes in the ISO, and the aperture is set at f4. It's in the aperture priority mode, and the camera can no longer increase the shutter speed because it's at the maximum at 1/2000th of a second. So after that, the images begin to be overexposed. Okay. All right. Thank you, Jessica. So I'm sorry if I get your name incorrect here. I apologize. Sahuzmrutik, I hope I said that somewhat correctly. So with the bracketing images, I need more. It's a beautiful, beautiful image, but it looks, first of all, it looks as if you cropped it, no cropping. It's a lovely image, but I want to see all of them, okay, for bracketing. For equivalent exposures, as we discussed, all of the images should be the same in terms of light and dark. So it's a great example of what happens when you do change the exposure. But I want to see them all at probably about this exposure in terms of light and dark. Okay. Then with the ISO, in this case, it took me a little while to figure out what was happening. They are all the same image. So if we look here at the file name, image number 1681, they are all 1681, so different versions of it. So get me the a set of the images where you did change the ISO in each frame. Okay, all right, thank you. And finally, Tanya, let's look at yours. So with bracketing, again, you only needed to do the whole stop numbers, so you didn't need to have 21 frames. Probably 8 or so is what I'd expect to see. So these, sorry, not 8, what am I saying? 3 per set. So this is a great range, but let's choose this one here, a dark one, and kind of medium one here, and then light, and we'll look at them here. Oh, didn't catch the light one, sorry. All right, sorry about that. All right, what is wrong with this? All right, we'll compare them this way. So, very light, looks great. Too dark. Okay, so just 3 frames per set is sufficient, and the same with the second set as well. Okay. And with equivalent exposures, also, we definitely don't need 34 of them. I see some of them get lighter and some are a little bit darker. So so just like 8 or at most 10 equivalent exposures, one for each whole stop setting that you have. And most lenses have about 8, a range of about 8 stops from the largest to the smallest aperture. Okay. And ISO, I was a little unclear as to what was going on here. So you do go from, starts at ISO 2800, and then they go up and up, but you never gave us the lower ISO ratings that I could see. So if you start at, again, like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, 25,600, and then, yeah, that should be sufficient. Okay. Okay, great job, you guys. Thank you. I'm sorry you did not attend, but there you have it. Hope that this feedback is helpful to you, and I hope to see you in later meetings. Please remember that I have office hours every week on Wednesdays from 12:30 to 2:30. And if that doesn't work for you, let me know and we can arrange to meet at some other time that works for both of us. I look forward to seeing your next assignment. And if you have questions about that, again, please let me know. Okay, take care.